the DeFUD podcast. Hello and welcome to the DeFUD podcast. In this episode, we're honored to have Ofir Har-Chen join us. He's the co-founder and CEO of an amazing company called Clutch Security. Clutch Security is addressing the increasing critical challenge of non-human identity security within modern enterprises. Prior to being the CEO of Clutch Security, Ofir was the Chief Operating Officer of Hunters AI, an AI-powered next-gen SIM, which revolutionizes the way that security operations centers operate. And here's an interesting fact. Ofir started his career as an UAV systems operator for the Israel Defense Forces, IDF. So Ofir, what an interesting and phenomenal background. Thanks for joining us.
Thank you. Thank you for having me.
Yeah, so one question I'd always love to start out these conversations with is, tell me about a formative experience in your life or your career that has led you to this point today.
That's a great question. I think it would have to be probably my first job in cybersecurity. So straight out of the army, I go to work at one of the biggest VARs in Israel, value-added resellers. And I think probably on my second day at work, my boss comes over and he says, "Do you know what a SIM is?" And I said, "Well, sounds like an acronym, but I have no idea. Just tell me." And he says, "Well, it's security, information, and event management." And I said, "Okay, so what does it do?" And he told me it's basically a system that pulls data from lots of sensors on the network and sends them over to the SOC. And I said, "Okay, cool. Well, why are we talking about this?" And he said, "Well, it's your first week here. There's a new product, SIM product by one vendor, and you're going to deploy it on one of the biggest banks in Israel in about a week. Here's the PDF, 400 pages. Good luck to you." And kind of just send me on my way. And the formative experience was that throughout this entire role, basically, almost every week or two, I was exposed to a new technology, from switches and routers to firewalls, load balancers, Active Directory environments, proxies, email gateways, SIMs. So just, I would say, being immersed in the entire technological stack of very big enterprises, both from an IT perspective and a security perspective. So I would say it put me in a position of really understanding customers very well and seeing the efficacy of a lot of products out there, what they do well, what they don't, and also just how the vendors themselves operate, and me kind of being the buffer and kind of bridging and being a mediator of sorts. And actually in this job, I actually encountered what would later become non-human identities. And that was just being service account in Active Directory, and all the vendors really required them to be able to do what they do. So I would say a really formative experience for me.
Got it. Wow, it's hard to imagine that, given that you were the CEO of Hunters, that at some point in your life you didn't know what a SIM was, right? So what an incredible journey from that starting point.
I have to agree, yeah.
And so, of course, the topic of non-human identity has been extremely popular this year, and I'm sure a lot of it also due to your recent launch and the amount of awareness that it's created, right? So maybe for our audience today, can you walk us through the top use cases for non-human identity security and governance? And what does risk management of NHI mean in a typical enterprise?
Right. So I think what's important to understand about non-human identities before we get to the use cases is really to discern and distill the difference between human and non-human identities, because that's really the key to then take us to use cases. So I think, especially when we're looking at enterprises today, you're going to see that the identity fabric of the enterprise is really going to consist of two types of identities, obviously human identities and non-human identities. And I think human identities are really the more simple ones that we all know and love, right? It's our employees, our contractors, our third-party vendors. And when we look at this type of identity, we're going to see that it's almost always really centrally managed, either with Okta or Azure AD or Active Directory. It's, I would say, relatively low volume. We're not going to have any enterprise today with 10 million human identities. These things don't really exist. And then we get to privileges. That's another aspect. And I would say the majority of our employees in the typical enterprise are actually unprivileged. And of course, security control wise, we have MFA, conditional access policies, etc. And then when we actually pivot to non-human identities, we see the exact opposite, because non-human identities are fragmented across the enterprise because they're in cloud environments, they're in SaaS, and they're also in on-prem environments. So instead of being centrally managed like human identities are, these things are fragmented, and there isn't an Okta for these things, and you can't really provision and deprovision them centrally. You have to go to the end system to do it. So that's one thing. The second thing I want to say is really volume. We see a lot of ratios being thrown around, 45 to 1, 50 to 1, 25 to 1. It really changes based on the size of the enterprise and just maybe the vertical that they're in, if it's the technology vertical, maybe e-commerce. But the important thing to note is that it's a huge, huge volume as opposed to human identities. And of course, privilege-wise, these things are almost always privileged by design, right? Because they keep the lights on in production, they interconnect and power up our corporate systems. And so they need those privileges in order to be able to do what they need to do. And lastly, when we look at security controls, there isn't any MFA for these things, right? And I think today, most of the time, if an API key of some SaaS gets compromised or leaked on the internet, or maybe a secret used by a workload in the cloud, usually it's going to be possible for the adversary to use these things from anywhere in the world. And the problem is today, if that's going to happen, the typical enterprise probably won't even know about it because there's so much noise, right? And I think now when we understand this landscape, looking at the use cases, I think, well, the majority of enterprises today really struggle with knowing just at a basic level what non-human identities they even have in the landscape to begin with. And again, it's basically everywhere because it's in cloud, it's in SaaS, it's in the code, it's being stored in vaults, it's in SaaS, and it's even in on-prem. It's just everywhere. And it's literally interconnected because today SaaS speaks to cloud, speaks to CI/CD, speaks to vaults. So it makes the problem even more challenging. And the ability to know what you have across the entire enterprise and learn more about your environment, that's huge because the way I look at it, it's almost as going from lights off to lights on with a flip of a switch. That's one thing. Once you do that, you start to tackle the use cases of just lifecycle management. What's being rotated automatically and what's not? What's about to expire, and maybe we can actually avert downtime if we prevent it from happening, right? What's not being used, and we can just end the life cycle of this non-human identity right here, right now. Then we get to just posture and risk management. Think about your typical, maybe overprivileged service accounts. We see that quite often. Think about even employees who worked at the company and they're no longer there. And in their tenure, they created some API keys, some secrets, and these things are still active because, again, it all comes back to the fact that it's a fragmented landscape. So even if the employee hasn't been with the company for like 5 years, these identities are still active and used, and they can be used after the fact by that person, right? And of course, myself coming from a background of incident response, we take with us here at Clutch the mentality of assume breach. So it's not a question of if something's going to happen. Unfortunately, it's a question of when, right? So you need to be able to have effective and efficient detection and response practices to be able to detect compromises of NHIs in real time. But then again, have very efficient response and know the blast radius, know who to contact, what's the stake, what's the blast radius, etc. So that's, I would say, the biggest use cases that we see.
And of course, after you just went through that, right, you painted a really compelling picture of why NHIs are important. And I think I want to index on the blast radius piece, right? So, of course, I've also dealt with this firsthand, running engineering teams in AWS, where I know this is not best practice, and you're probably going to roll your eyes at me, right? Many engineers logging into the same AWS service account to deploy to prod or to staging. So tell me about why, NHIs at this moment of time has gone through such a, emergence, right? We've heard about Okta, right? Identity access governance for human actors, but why has this become such an issue now?
Really good question. I think that there's 2 reasons for that. One thing is just what we've been seeing lately in security, which is just platformization, right? There's a lot of consolidation that's been taking place in the security ecosystem. And when this happens, it really allows, I would say, a gap in the market and allows new companies to come in with really innovative solutions that can actually fulfill unmet needs. So that's one thing. But I think that's not enough, because we need to see that this need is really there. And I think if we look at the threat landscape, And just the attacks that we saw, the ones that we know happened because they've been published in the past year and a half, we see and understand why it's now taking place. You can look at the Okta breach and how Cloudflare was actually impacted by that breach, right? Needing to rotate thousands over thousands of service accounts. And if you miss just one or two, that can be detrimental. And of course, the Circle CI breach, where it's a classic supply chain scenario. You're using a specific vendor who unfortunately got compromised. Now you need to deal with it, and it's not even under your control. And now you need to go all over the place and look for the blast radius and where are we using these things, and if they're compromised, what's going to happen, and if we rotate something, what's going to break in production, right? So I think that looking at the platformization and I would say that the gap in the market, and then also seeing all of a sudden all these attacks coming in, and by the way, needing to remember that it's probably, at least in my perspective, one of the oldest problems in cybersecurity. This goes all the way back to Windows NT4 in 1996 and Active Directory in I think 1999, service accounts, right? I would say as technology progressed, we see how there's a need to use more and more of these things. Up until maybe 15 years ago, we just had on-prem. So we kind of had the perimeter, we had firewalls, we had IPS, everything was contained in AD, and we of course had EDR on workstations. So attackers needed to do a lot of things in order to get to those accounts. But whenever an attacker compromises a network, the second they get to an NHI, that's the tipping point of a breach. That's what I saw in my days doing IR. The attackers are always looking for the most privileged accounts, and those are usually those NHIs, which of course aren't really tended to because they're operating under the surface. No one is usually looking at them. And so they're hiding in plain sight, looking for, waiting for attackers to just snatch them and just cause havoc in the network.
So I like that imagery that you just painted, which is hiding under the surface. Makes sense because, when you go onto the Clutch Security homepage, there's an image of an iceberg, right? And all of these NHIs and, your Slack accounts, Jira accounts, right? Just kind of hiding behind the surface. And so, of course, now, we're convinced, right, that this is a real problem and it's a growing market. Is, more specifically on Clutch side, is what makes it a unique offering among the landscape, and we've seen many NHI providers start this year.
Yeah, I think when you're trying to solve a problem, it's really useful to have experienced the problem yourself. So I would say that, again, going back to my first job, every technology that I had to implement with each and every one of those customers back in my days in VAR, almost every vendor required some sort of service account in order to be able to actually kind of implement the solution and get it to work. And I would always get one or two responses from a customer whenever I asked for that service account, which, by the way, almost always was a domain admin. Customers would either tell me, no way we're giving you domain admin. Let's work with the vendor. Let's open a service ticket and make sure what privileges are actually needed. And that would frustrate a lot of customers. And by the way, sometimes the vendor would say, if you do not give us domain admin privileges, you're not going to be eligible for support. So that was one case, which was very interesting. The second type of customer was actually the ones who would tell me, oh yeah, we have one dedicated service account for that. There you go. Here's the credentials, use it. And I kind of started to scratch my head and asking myself, well, this is going to be a big problem at some point, right? Again, that's from the VAR perspective, just from the management. Now then, doing incident response, again, being in a customer's environment, looking at how an attacker got in, how they moved, and the fact that they used those NHIs and how they were unguarded, showed me that there's not just an operational challenge, there's also an actual security risk there, right? And then, of course, being at Hunters, that's when the Circle CI breach happened, and I saw just the extent of effort that it takes customers in real time whenever they need to respond to such a scenario, such a breach. Where is everything being located? What's going to break if we rotate it? So I literally kind of saw my entire journey in cybersecurity and literally could pinpoint almost at any point in my career how those things kind of show themselves for a second. And it really showed me that this is a big problem. And so I think knowing and understanding viscerally the problem allows you really to be informed on how to solve it. And that takes me to really, I think, one of the biggest concepts that we have in Clutch, which is the identity lineage. Identity lineage is a concept that we've termed that basically said that every non-human identity that you have, if it's a service account in Active Directory on-prem or an API key of some SaaS application that you have, or even a secret used by a workload in a cloud, it's always going to live inside of an ecosystem that consists of 5 elements. There's the origin, that's the source of truth, where the identity was provisioned in. There's people, that's the attribution to the workforce, right? The employees who created the identity, had access to it, etc. Then there's storage, the places where these identities are being stored at. It can be a passive manager, it could be a vault, it could even be hard-coded in code. Maybe it's being stored in Jenkins, right? That kind of thing. Then there's consumers. Those are the systems using these identities programmatically to perform operations. Lastly, resources. That's the last part. Just the things I would be able to access and the things I would be able to do on those resources should I retain access to this identity. And this concept allows us to really intuitively visualize to our customers the ecosystem in which the identity lives. And we kind of zoom out from the identity and look at the entire ecosystem in which it operates. And then customers can actually see how one API key that they have and which they thought is doing just one thing is also doing a bunch of other things, which they just weren't aware of. So I would say that knowing the problem really informed us in having a really novel approach to solving the problem.
And I love that actually, that representation, right? Graph analysis has been such a popular concept in security, especially recently, because, one thing, they're all interconnected, from identities to systems to even the data, right? That's contained within these systems.
Mhm.
One thing I did want to touch upon is obviously you have incredible incident response background. How has that also informed the proactive, right? The risk management, the governance aspect of NHIs on the platform?
Yeah, so in terms of being proactive, one of the core tenets that we take with us is we actually don't want customers to spend a whole lot of time on the product. We want to be able to actually save them time, because today, especially in security, no one has time, right? And so when it comes to being proactive, it's the ability to not having the customer need to come into the product and do things, but rather just doing it for them and being proactive. And I can also take it to a place of, instead of, I would say, building a lot of detections in order to be able to detect the next attack, maybe making sure that the next attack just doesn't really happen, because we know the threat landscape and where it's going to come from. So building those controls and allowing the customers to implement them to make sure that they're actually being proactive, and I would say not needing to wait for the next breach to happen and then going into IR mode and the entire security team's heads down in IR mode and everything has to stop.
That makes a lot of sense. And one thing I've really actually appreciated about the platform is just the visibility, right, overall that you bring. And so connect maybe the dots for me here. So how do you connect visibility to better remediation, and then also overall awareness, right? Because you mentioned just a few breaches already, like the Okta breach, Cloudflare breach, Circle CI. Like, how do you stay ahead of these evolving threats with the pillars that you just laid out in the platform?
Yeah, I think that one of the biggest things that we're able to accomplish is really giving customers what I would call aha moments. So they would come into the platform and they would look at a specific secret or an API key and see how it's not just an API key that's connecting different SaaS applications, but it's actually connecting to different terrains, is what we call them in Clutch. Terrain could be SaaS, could be cloud, could be on-prem, could be data, could be CI/CD. And the understanding that it's not about solving for a specific terrain, right? It's not about solving NHI for cloud or NHI for SaaS. Today, the entire enterprise interconnected with these identities. So the ability to show customers the extent of where these NHIs are operating in, they can then see, oh, wow, this HubSpot API key is connecting to things that I didn't even know existed. And we're about to decommission this system. So I guess it's going to impact this other team who's using this NHI to connect, right? So the more aha moments we can give a customer, and the more, I would say, I don't know, maybe removing the fog of war from that ecosystem really allows
You're coming up
customers.
with all the hot takes today. Terrain instead of environments, fog of war. We're gonna have to hashtag those.
That's good. I used to play a lot of Command and Conquer back in my days, so maybe that
Yeah,
should.
and that's coming through pretty clearly. Sorry, I interrupted.
No, so again, for us, it's the ability to really show customers their environment and being more smart about the way it operates. And once they understand that, they can then take action and say, wow, I didn't know that if I remove this identity or change it, it's going to impact a different part of our ecosystem, which we weren't aware of actually being existing.
Got it. And so that actually brings me to, usually my favorite question of these episodes, which is, walk me through some customer success stories, right? You talk about the fog of war, the aha moment. Like, tell me about some of your best aha moments with customers.
So the most recent one was actually, I spoke before about how I look at visibility as from lights off to lights on with the flip of the switch. And usually what we see is, when a customer would see the environment and we'd kind of walk them through everything that we're seeing. And they would say, oh, well, this guy is no longer with the company. We need to do something about this identity, etc. But one thing that happened recently, which made me smile, I was on the call, was that the customer actually told us, wow, you see this service account right here? I've been with the company for like a year and a half. And I've always kind of seen it around and seeing it in different places. And I never really knew kind of who to go to and who actually created this thing. And you actually found it and told me without me needing to kind of connect the dots or correlating. You just literally found who's the owner and creator of this service account. And I have a bunch of questions for him now. So I'm going to go ahead and ask him after the call. So that was a really cool moment for us.
Wow. So basically showing the customer what they didn't even know about their own terrain, right? Using your own words.
Exactly right.
That's awesome. Well, thank you so much for being, so gracious and spending, your time with us today. I'd love to maybe have one word of advice that you can leave with our listeners today, which is for folks who are interested in starting companies in cybersecurity, what is one piece of wisdom that you would give them?
For me, it's really about, I want to say, friendships and choosing the people I want to say, go to war with. And for me, with my two co-founders, I felt after the process that we've done that beyond just being business partners, we can become real friends. And that's actually what happened very fast. And so I think when you have such partners, then when the bad times are there, then those are bad times, but you're in the trenches with people you love, which helps you kind of weather the storm. And when it's good, then it's really good with people that you really love. So I would say really focus on choosing the right partners on the journey and executing with them in the best way possible.
Wow. Goes very deep. And actually, I know you recently published a blog about your personal journey to Clutch and how that has shaped your worldview. So folks, definitely check it out. We'll drop the link in the comments in the chat below. So thanks so much for Ofir for joining us today.
Thanks, Nancy.